My name is Mo Chakraborty from Salisbury University. I will be collecting questions in the chat for this session, which is titled Asking the Big Questions That Guide Small Decisions, Developing Academic Library Infrastructure in Support of Graduate Students' Qualitative Research. Jessica, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. And thank you to the conference organizers for such a well-run program. I really appreciate it, as I'm sure everyone does. So this conference calls for us to consider how the work of academic libraries can be structured in ways that support the diverse and shifting needs of graduate students on our campuses. In this presentation, I'll be sharing a series of 4 types of questions that can be used for engaging specifically with researchers conducting qualitative work. These questions can be used in direct conversation with graduate students, in consultations or reference interactions, or in developing workshops, classroom instruction, or research guides. This structure provides a way of enhancing the library infrastructure for qualitative research, even in cases where library workers are not experienced in qualitative methodologies, or where there is limited or inconsistent access to the software frequently used for qualitative data analysis. Or to put it more simply, you can use these questions whether or not you know or want to know how to use NVivo. Before I get to these questions, however, I wanted to spend a brief amount of time discussing why we may need to further development of infrastructure in support of qualitative data analysis and how I came to these particular recommendations. Part of the expectation when I was hired for my role in the summer of 2019 was that I'd be the person to whom questions about NVivo or Atlas TI, the 2 programs that we offer in my library, are referred, and that I would teach the workshops on these 2 programs. Since then, I've expanded our workshops to include another popular soft program, MaxQDA, and one free tools, one on free tools for analysis, which I focus on to get, and QualCoder, and then another workshop that is more generally about planning qualitative data analysis without a specific software in mind. In working with a variety of qualitative researchers in workshops and in consultations, I've seen that questions that are ostensibly about technology for qualitative data analysis are often bigger questions about how the individual will conduct their research. A question about how to code data in NVivo, for example, might turn into a conversation about where those codes come from and how they're actually used to answer their research questions. My approach to working with qualitative researchers is also driven by multiple research projects. In a forthcoming paper from iAssist Quarterly, I've discussed a project with Hilary Bissell at Ohio State University, in which we interviewed academic librarians about their perceptions of how qualitative data is integrated into academic library work around data literacy and other data services. I'm also currently analyzing data from interviews with 19 students, faculty, and staff at my own institution about how they've learned to conduct qualitative data analysis and about their experiences using software for qualitative data analysis. Before we move any further, I think it's important to briefly discuss the meaning of the phrase qualitative research, because it's quite a messy category with no single characteristic that applies to all qualitative work. I take a very broad definition here, drawing on 2 methodological works. Mario Small, who notes that when we use the word qualitative, we could be referring to one of 3 aspects of the project, including the type of data, the method of data collection, and the method of analysis. In a similar vein, Virginia Brown and Victoria Clark differentiate between what they call big Q qualitative research and small Q qualitative research, definitions they draw from feminist psychologists Louise Kidder and Michelle Fine. Big Q qualitative research refers to work that recognizes and embraces the subjective nature of research and the positionality of the researcher, and appreciates results that show nuance and even contradiction. Small Q qualitative research may use qualitative data or methods of analysis, but sees a more objective role for the researcher and may involve using larger amounts of data to develop generalizable claims about the subject under study. Given the diversity of approaches to qualitative research, it is probably not surprising that there are a few standardized methods to approach qualitative analysis. I use methods here to refer to the specific tasks that a researcher uses to collect and analyze data in order to develop an answer to their research questions. For example, a researcher conducting a study that uses interviews may decide to transcribe the data, code the data using an inductive approach, that is beginning with the data itself rather than a pre-existing coding schema, and then look to see where those codes appear together in different interviews to help them develop categories or themes for a thematic analysis. Ideally, methods choices are driven by the methodology and theory that ground the research, and the related assumptions about how new knowledge should be created and about whether we can even have access to the reality of lived experience. But even with a specific methodology and theory in mind, there are rarely step-by-step directions for how the researcher should conduct their work, a situation made even more difficult by the limited detail about how qualitative data analysis is actually conducted in most research publications. If you've ever watched the show Schitt's Creek, this scene probably doesn't need much explanation, but if you haven't had the opportunity yet, this is a meme version of a scene where Moira and David, members of a formerly wealthy family, are attempting to make a family recipe that calls for them to fold in the cheese. It quickly becomes clear that neither of them has any idea what it means to fold in the cheese. Sarah Curtis, a professor in education at the University of Delaware, shared this meme version in which the supposedly simple fold in the cheese has been replaced with the theoretically simple idea to code the data. The work of qualitative data analysis sounds simple. You code the data, find the emerging themes, but like so many things, it's much more complicated than that. And students may not always have the chance to develop these skills before they get to the point of conducting their own research. You would probably expect this question of how to actually conduct data analysis would be addressed in methodology courses, and to some extent that is true. But in my conversations with qualitative researchers for this study on learning to conduct qualitative analysis, I found that this was not always the case, or that their coursework is insufficient. One PhD student who had previously taken multiple qualitative methods courses as an undergraduate and master's student described a feeling that the courses were useful and interesting, but never provided the space or foundation to get into the practice of analyzing qualitative data. Other students, particularly those working in fields where qualitative research is less common, describe an experience of developing qualitative analysis approach with little guidance from advisors or committee members when working on a master's thesis or dissertation. The same experience plays out when it comes to the use of technology for qualitative data analysis, driven at least in part by the challenges of software access and the proliferation of tools. At a campus like my own, where there is no single software made available to everyone on campus, the researchers will likely be using a wide range of software programs, which increases the difficulty of offering support. And that's how you end up with 5 different workshops. When support is available for the use of qualitative data analysis software, it will often be in the form of the workshop, such as this I teach, that focus on the technical aspects of the software, rather than being integrated into the qualitative methodology courses. In order to use this software effectively, researchers need to translate the specifics of their project into an analytic practice, and standalone workshops may not be sufficient to build this bridge. Some libraries do, of course, offer resources for qualitative researchers, including collection items on conducting qualitative work and access to software or instruction on the use of software for qualitative data analysis. Mandy Swigart-Hobo has a really great example of how she's offered a workshop on NVivo in collaboration with a disciplinary faculty member, which was explicitly developed to help researchers learn how to both use the tool and to conduct analysis of qualitative data. But here too, challenges remain, with qualitative data perhaps remaining the Jan Brady of data-related work in academic libraries compared to the more popular Marsha of quantitative and big data. Recent research suggests that it is difficult to locate information on qualitative specific services on academic library websites. And there just may not always be a staff member who is interested or able to offer software support, even when access is provided at the campus level. One of the participants on my study with academic librarians was approaching retirement, and having become the de facto NVivo expert as the only one with relevant experience when the program was installed on library computers, she expected that once she left campus, there would be no one who would be available to offer support for that software. I think this participant's experience is like many of us. We end up taking on work that is beyond the scope of our position description because we recognize that it is needed. As I describe a way to develop transformative services for grad students, I want to be clear that I recognize the potential for scope creep and that many library workers are already going above and beyond their position descriptions. And I don't imagine that many people working in libraries are expected to be experts on qualitative methodologies or the use of software in this work. Further, I want to acknowledge that my position as a faculty librarian at a large research university means I have the space and resources that are not available on all campuses. such as access to multiple software programs and an existing robust workshop series that I did not have to build from the ground up. I do think, however, that regardless of the available resources and individual experiences with qualitative researchers, library workers are well-trained and experienced in asking questions that help individuals articulate what it is they need to know and the next steps in their research. And it is this skill that I suggest we use, drawing on 4 types of questions that I'll describe in the next part of this presentation. As I shared earlier, I'll describe 4 types of questions that can be used to engage with qualitative researchers in a variety of settings. This conversation could be in one-on-one conversations or consultations with graduate researchers by subject specialists or those working in lab spaces where the software may be located. Alternatively, these questions could be used to develop workshops around qualitative data analysis, either generally or to a specific software program that is available to patrons. This is a tactic I use in my own workshops. Rather than framing the workshop around software features, I ask participants to think about the following issues in their own research and decide how the features of a tool may help them to conduct their work, or recognize that there may not be a need for a particular tool. These questions could also be used to structure a research page or a LibGuide, directing patrons to relevant resources, or just asking them to consider the following issues. One of the most useful conversations to have with patrons around qualitative data analysis is about their goals. By asking researchers where they hope to take their work, we can help them to identify a path to get there. I have found it particularly helpful to ask researchers about their research questions and the form of the results that they anticipate in answering these questions. Well, of course, they do not know the answer to the specific answer. They probably have at least an idea of what the form of the answer might take. If we were using interviews to understand how different groups of graduate students experience library services, we might want to use demographic data to put transcripts into groups and then code for types of experiences with collections and services. Then we could make a claim like, students in the sciences describe access to collections in this way, while those in the social sciences describe it in a different way. Analyzing data toward this sort of claim would be a different process than if we wanted to identify narratives about accessing library materials for research work in these same interviews. The more traditional library role of identifying research resources can be of particular use here, as one way that students can learn to identify how they might structure their results is by modeling their work after previous researchers who have explored the topic or used their methodology. I often encourage researchers to look at examples of dissertations or theses conducted with their advisor or committee members, or that even cite a pivotal work in their field or methodology. I would hope that all researchers hope to engage in ethical research as one of their goals, but ethics, like qualitative research itself, is a tricky concept to define. Many researchers will need to fill out applications for their institutional review board to ensure that their work meets the basic requirements for protection of human subjects. But of course, there's more to ethics than the IRB, particularly when we consider the relationship with participants. By asking researchers to describe their relationship with those that they study, we can encourage frank discussions about the differences in power and the benefits of the research process for ourselves and for our participants. This discussion is especially important when the researcher is not a member of the group being studied, but for whom they intend to give voice in addressing oppressive systems and structures. Kelly Limes, Taylor Henderson, and Jennifer Esposito offer a very important reminder of the fact that in most cases, researchers stand to benefit much more from the potential participants from the research process, and that ethical research must recognize these power and benefit dynamics. Questions of ethics are also important when we consider the case of reusing data and data sharing. In some cases, IRBs may not see the reuse of existing data as a type of human subjects research that requires their review. In that case, the researcher must consider whether the initial data collection process was done in a way that allows ethical reuse of that data. When discussing goals with researchers, we can also encourage them to describe where they anticipate sharing their work. For many graduate students, the first audience will be their advisor or committee members who will decide whether they earn their master's or doctorate degree. Some will also hope to publish their research with their disciplinary community, and other students may have commitments to share their data with participants or stakeholders in their research process. All of these audiences are likely to have different expectations about how the research process should be conducted and reported, though these expectations may not be made clear until the reader is presented with a report that violates their expectations. I've worked with a number of graduate students whose advisors or committee members clearly have a different conception of what it means to do qualitative research than the graduate student. As we can see, when they wonder why the sample was not randomly selected, or require that a student conduct inter-rater reliability assessments for a methodology in which this method of measurement is not usually applied. This is another place where it can be valuable for students to locate relevant research on which to model their work, or to help develop questions that they could ask of their committee before they get to the process of conducting their research. We could probably consider all of these questions so far to be as related to the context of the research, but here by context, I mean specifics of the student's situation that will impact their research process, such as the time they have available to learn a new qualitative data analysis software tool, or the resources to purchase a license for the product. A student who needs to submit a draft of their dissertation to an advisor soon may not have time to learn to use in vivo, and instead may find it better for their specific context to use the tools they already have available, even if those tools are ultimately less efficient in the long run. Instead, they may decide to conduct their coding in a spreadsheet or using comments in a text document. Context could also refer to the other individuals involved in the project. Collaborative and data analysis can be extremely challenging, and I always encourage researchers to develop a plan for their process and to test it out with a small amount of data before they begin their work at a large scale. Testing the process is especially important when researchers are using software that may require merging different files or moving data between programs. And finally, the type of data involved in the project and its scope is another important contextual consideration. Those working with small amounts of data may not find it worth their time and resources to learn to use a software program, but those with larger amounts of data or multimedia data may find that the time to learn the tool is ultimately worth the investment of their resources. I presented 4 different broad categories of questions that can be used to drive conversations with graduate students conducting qualitative research. In doing so, I've divided these elements into neat categories, but I imagine you can tell how all of these aspects of the research process are interconnected, such as the questions of goals and audiences. I don't imagine that you would work through this list of questions when you sit down, all of this list of questions when you sit down to meet with a new graduate student, or when they ask questions about using in vivo at the lab, just as you wouldn't ask all of your reference interview questions for every patron who comes to the desk. But when the opportunity does arise to engage in conversation or develop new learning opportunities with graduate students, I hope that you will find these provide a structure for engaging with those students. And that is the end of my presentation. I have full references that will be in the slides that will be in the repository, should you like to see those, including for the tweet from Schitt's Creek, which is my very favorite slide I think I've ever made. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Don't see any questions yet. You shared a lot of good data, good information, so everybody's like taking it in. And Margaret says, excellent presentation. Thank you. So this one comment, this set of terms questions also seem like it could be useful for students in fields that don't identify their research as qualitative. For example, a field like history that relies on primary source analysis. There are contextual questions for that, like, do you need to visit an archive?
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I don't work with very many history students as a social sciences person, and we have a separate history librarian, but I think, yeah, the same sort of thing. And how would you actually work with this data? What do you need to do with it? I guess my brief experience from history indicates that it's not discussed in the same way, but could be. And yeah, that might be useful for kind of engaging with them in the same way.
And I have a question from Stacy. Do you use any of the Sage Explorer or research method modules in your instruction, as she teaches across many fields, research methods, and developing content for qualitative?
I don't use any of their like instructional content in any of my courses, but I do refer people. We have a lot of their content, like the data sets and the foundation series, I think are really great for people who are new to qualitative research, or those people who are in fields who don't do a lot of qualitative research that they don't, it's just a very good sort of foundational. There's a lot of basic description, like reference, a reference source really in a lot of cases, or the handbooks. So I do often refer people to their content. Occasionally use the data, but I don't use the other stuff. Yeah, it is really expensive. I want to, coming from a less well-resourced university to here has been kind of a shock. So yes.
And then Jill just follows up saying that she's a former history librarian. And yes, that's what she likes about the broad terms you use. They can also be applied to more humanities-oriented research. There's another question here from Angie. Thanks for the great presentation. Do you have a way to present these big questions to your students? For example, reflection questions, checklists, etc.
I don't usually hand them a list of questions. It is usually in conversation. So when people come to consult with me, I do in workshops though. I do try to frame the workshops around these questions, not quite so explicitly, but I start off with, we talk about resources and time. And I really encourage them to start with that goal, and that the question about what does it look like to answer your question, to me is really similar to when someone asks you a question at the desk and they're trying to find something, and I can find it really helpful to say, what does the perfect thing look like? What does it look like? And then we can often backtrack to find kind of what they're looking for. So a similar kind of question. So what would it look like to answer this? And then we talk more specifically about what could you actually do with your data to answer this? Do you need to code it at all? Do you need to transcribe it? Sometimes people have these ideas of how you should work with data that are not necessarily relevant to how they're doing their work, or is maybe more work than they need to do. So yeah, we really definitely start with that big question. I also do encourage them to talk to advisors. The class I teach on qualitative data analysis software, we actually spent a class session looking for dissertations, for example, and we looked at ProQuest dissertations, which I realize is another resource that not everyone has. But we were able to look for dissertations that cited Brown and Clark's article on thematic analysis, which has been cited thousands and thousands of times on thematic analysis. So they were able to kind of look for examples there. So I don't present it as a checklist or anything. I have thought about making something they might fill out during the workshop, but most people attend online now, so I haven't figured out the best way to really share them that way.
So I have a question from Maria. What did you find to be the most challenging aspects of understanding how to use and interpret qualitative data methodology to students? He frequently works with doctoral students in assisting with data analysis for quantitative data, and the potential for scope creep has always been a challenge. So I'm wondering what your challenge was in making sure that you were not responsible for more.
That's a good question. I think the questions to me are actually the key, because it puts it back onto them to articulate what they want to do and what their ideas are. And then recognizing when they need to go back to an advisor, or establishing a task like, well, why don't you get the trial version of in vivo and see if you can do this thing that we've talked about, and then we can come back again. And there's also just really a challenge. I actually don't have much in the way of formal methods training. I've just learned it all through doing and reading a lot of those things in Sage research methods. So just the variety of people talk about a relatively small number of ways of engaging with data and a lot of different methodologies. So learning to translate what they might say, I'm going to use grounded theory, which is a huge approach. And, well, what does this look like for your project? So learning kind of the language and the different ways different disciplines talk about the same thing, because I do think they're often talking about the same things in just different disciplinary language. So kind of learning to translate that has been a challenge. But thankfully for me, it's something that I enjoy, because it'd be really tiresome if I had to do it all the time and didn't like it.
Don't see any other question, but Jill just follows up from a previous comment. Yes, the perfect thing question can also be helpful, gets them thinking about what they wish for, and then you can help them brainstorm about what else could work if that kind of source happens not to be available.
I really do think that my experience in public services and reference is hugely valuable here. And I think all of you, as well, if you work in any sort of public services role, this idea of getting people to draw out and talk more about what they want to do. Like the question is often, how do I do this thing in vivo? But they need to learn, they need to decide, like, do they want to use, they want to put their participants into categories and then code them. And then, what does it look like? Do they want to compare? What kind of groups do they want to compare across? And so it needs to focus on the outcome instead of, I could show them how to code something in vivo, but it might not answer their question if they haven't figured out what it is that they want to do, which is really similar to those questions of, do you have any books about whatever? Or like in my library, you come in and you don't actually see the books. So there's often a question about where are the books? And of course we have to ask, get them to say what they're looking for. So yeah, I think reference is a great basis for this.
Seeing no other questions, thank you, Jessica. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you for the questions, everyone. I appreciate it.